Fred Gomez Carrasco was a notorious drug cartel boss from San Antonio. After years earning millions and running from the cops, Carrasco was serving a life sentence when he decided to break out of the Walls Unit, the oldest prison in Texas. Carrasco and two henchmen took over the prison library. They held teachers and librarians captive as Carrasco bartered for his freedom.
Now, there's only one way that these people will see the light again, and that's for you to cooperate.
The standoff set off one of the worst hostage crises in American history, the 1974 Huntsville prison siege.
This will be our last day to live if somebody doesn't come through and help us. They're desperate men and they mean business.
He's fixing to shoot me. I'm fixing to die if you don't do something right now. And the rest of us in there are going to die too. These people don't have anything to lose and they're serious.
And it's all on tape.
Fred, the governor's on for you. The governor wants to talk to you.
He can shove it.
From Imperative Entertainment, this is Standoff.
Dead or alive, I'm going out.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. A quick note. There are two available versions of this podcast, one in English as a red note and Spanish as La Nota Roja. If you would prefer to listen in Spanish, you can do so by searching for La Nota Roja in the same podcast app where you downloaded or streamed this episode. The femicide in Juarez is an important story that has never been presented in this way before. To allow English-speaking audiences to hear testimony from families of the victims and Mexican investigators and journalists who studied these events, some interviews have been translated into English by Mexican voice actors. From Imperative Entertainment, this is The Red Note. Let's begin the program.
In 2007, homicide statistics in Ciudad Juarez had been stable for several years. But there were ominous rumblings of trouble on the horizon. As the Great Recession was weakening financial markets and economies across the globe, University of Texas professor Ricardo Ainsley says,
"The economic situation in Juarez was a disaster. Something like 50% of the maquiladora industry in Juarez was servicing the United States auto industry. And in the United States, that auto industry was on the verge of collapse. Many, many people lost their jobs during that time. So Juarez was a city suffering tremendous unemployment."
The U.S. Immigration Act of 1996 had deported more than 500,000 Mexican-born criminals from American prisons over the previous decade. With few jobs waiting for them in Juarez, it was a human resources bonanza for organized crime groups in the city. After the U.S. assault weapons ban expired in 2004, thousands of military-style firearms purchased legally north of the border were now smuggled to Mexico. Both sides of the border had corrupt officials and soldiers facilitating the entrance of these weapons.
Well, one thing we know very clearly is that all of the organized crime groups in Mexico, a significant perception of their armaments come across the border from the United States. Texas has a tremendous number of stores that sell guns and certainly gun shows within, say 100 miles of the border.
It was common knowledge in Juarez that corruption was a problem, especially among the municipal police. But few at the time realized the depths to which the Juarez cartel had penetrated inside the city's law enforcement.
You went from the Juarez police being the main armed wing of the cartel with pistols to people carrying AR-15s, AK-47s. And so the level of sophistication and power of the weaponry became a total game changer. And of course, that had a consequence in terms of levels of violence and victims also. But in 2007, Juarez is still relatively peaceful. You look at the headline of El Diario in January 1st, 2008 is, oh my God, we have 301 murders in the city. What a disaster 2007 was. What's happening? We need some responses. We need some explanations. We need to understand this. They had no idea what was coming.
This is episode 9 of The Red Note, The Imaginary War. My name is Lydia Cacho.
This episode is brought to you by The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you want a new podcast that you're definitely going to look forward to every week, one that's entertaining and packed with fantastic guests, well, this is the show for you. I mean, Apple named it the best of 2018, and that is a big award. Great guests like CEOs and FBI agents and rappers and political activists, all really spilling the tea on Jordan's show. Plus, he's so smart and funny and easy to listen to. I love the episodes with Celeste Headley, how to have conversations that matter, and also T-Pain and Auto-Tune. Yes, sign me up for that. Fantastic. This truly is an excellent interview show. You just can't go wrong with adding the Jordan Harbinger Show to your rotation. It is incredibly interesting. There's never a dull show. Search for the Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Fred Gomez Carrasco was a notorious drug cartel boss from San Antonio. After years earning millions and running from the cops, Carrasco was serving a life sentence when he decided to break out of the Walls Unit, the oldest prison in Texas. Carrasco and 2 henchmen took over the prison library. They held teachers and librarians captive as Carrasco bartered for his freedom.
Now, there's only one way that these people will see the light again, and that's for you to cooperate.
The standoff set off one of the worst hostage crises in American history, the 1974 Huntsville prison siege.
This will be our last day to live if somebody doesn't come through and help us. They're desperate men and they mean business.
He's fixing to shoot me. You know, I'm fixing to die if you don't do something right now. And the rest of us in there are going to die too. These people don't have anything to lose and they're serious.
And it's all on tape.
Fred, the governor's on for you. The governor wants to talk to you.
He can shove it.
From Imperative Entertainment, this is Standoff.
Dead or alive, I'm going out.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
In early 2008, authorities in El Paso arrested a Mexican police official with ties to the Juarez cartel. When this official started cooperating with U.S. authorities, historian Oscar Martinez writes that a rapid series of executions began in Juarez as the cartel tried to purge itself of potential traitors. This power struggle gave Sinaloa cartel leader Joaquin Guzman Loera, a.k.a. El Chapo, the opportunity he needed to launch a hostile takeover of the Juarez territory. Like the Juarez Cartel, the Sinaloa Cartel had emerged in the 1980s when the DEA's anti-smuggling campaigns in the Caribbean made Mexico's border cities the ideal route to ship drugs to the U.S. By this time, the Sinaloa Cartel had already seized control of the illegal drug trade in California and was overtaking Texas and Arizona.
My understanding of the Sinaloa move on Juarez was that Sinaloa had first tried to take control of Laredo, where the Gulf Cartel was running things. And for the same reasons that they later came to Juarez, because Laredo was a main thoroughfare for drug trafficking. When Sinaloa started making its move on Nuevo Laredo, you saw it with the execution of police, a lot of the same things we later saw in Juarez. So the Gulf Cartel hired and created the Zetas to help them fend off the Sinaloa Cartel. And they succeeded. Sinaloa had to beat a retreat out of Nuevo Laredo. They lost that battle. Retreating from Nuevo Laredo, then they said, well, then let's make the move on Juarez. And they did it in a very stealthy, very planful, strategic way. It wasn't just a bunch of guys going in with AK-47s, no. See, when they went into Nuevo Laredo, nobody knew about the Zetas. But when Sinaloa starts moving into Juarez, they learn from Nuevo Laredo. The first thing they start doing is they went after the police, because that was the armed wing of the Juarez cartel, and they wreaked havoc within the police force. They were being ambushed in their homes. It was something to behold.
Assassins working for the Sinaloa cartel publicly murdered several police officers who worked for the Juarez cartel. The Sinaloans unleashed La Gente Nueva, its paramilitary unit, along with 2 affiliated gangs in Juarez, the Artistas Asesinos and the Mexicals. The Juarez cartel countered with troops from its own armed wing, an army of former police officers called La Línea and the Barrio Azteca gang. Homicide rates in Juarez soared as the 2 cartels and their affiliates battled for control. Between 2001 and 2007, Juarez had seen an average of about 230 homicides per year. In 2008, that number climbed to more than 1,500. By 2010, when more than 3,500 citizens were murdered, Juarez was officially declared the most dangerous city in the world. You can still see the lingering effects of the war as you drive around downtown Juarez. Restaurants and shops that were boarded up a decade ago as their owners fled north of the border to El Paso. Half-finished construction projects, conceived and commenced during the maquiladora boom of the early 2000s, but halted during the fighting, never to be resumed. A monument to the city's unrealized dream of the past decade. According to Oscar Martinez, the mayhem unleashed by the fighting in Juarez gave other criminals the cover to launch their own wave of crime, kidnappings, bank robberies, car theft, assault, extortion, and express kidnappings against ordinary citizens became commonplace.
Juarez has a history of gang culture. In all these little neighborhoods, as one person told me, you know what? If you're a teenager, if there's 10 kids in your neighborhood, you form a gang. You're not necessarily involved in criminal activity. You may be smoking cigarettes underneath the tree at the corner. Or you may be having a beer. Or maybe another gang is stealing hubcaps.
Many teenage boys were abducted by the gangs and brought to the cartel to do vigilante work. They were the disposable boys, victims of human trafficking for organized crime. Everyone was discriminating against them for being poor, young, or indigenous. They were marked as criminals. Many were afraid and had no way out.
Part of the consequence of the militarization of the border is that the Juarez cartel, as other cartels too, started trying to monetize their product domestically. Historically, in Mexico, cocaine and heroin and stuff like that, all of those products were shipped to the United States. It didn't make sense to create a domestic drug market in Mexico when just crossing the border, that kilo of cocaine was worth many times more. But when the border started becoming militarized, they made a decision to create a domestic drug market. They would make less, but they would have a steady source of income. So now the local gangs become the players. Juarez had its Aztecas, who were their big bad gang. Sinaloa comes in and they start making inroads, and that's where the artistas asesinos come in. They were the Sinaloa version of the Aztecas. And a lot of the blood and the violence was between those groups. They were proxies for the Juarez and the Sinaloa cartel. When the violence starts happening, the ordinary street gangs start becoming involved. All over Juarez, people are being extorted. Small, medium, and large companies. That's because there's no authority. That isn't Juarez cartel, Sinaloa cartel. That's just people seizing the opportunity because there's no one to tell them no. And the Juarez cartel is no longer in charge. Because remember, the city was pretty safe. When the Juarez cartel was in charge, when Amado Carrillo was going to eat at the local restaurants, his favorite seafood place, whatever, people would not have gotten away with this stuff. They had a hold on this city. People were afraid to step out of line. But once it's all falling apart, it's like a mass chaos.
Even before the outbreak of the war, crime had been a major issue in Mexico's 2006 presidential campaign. Felipe Calderon Hinojosa, the candidate for Mexico's Conservative Party, PAN, had promised to launch a war on Mexico's drug cartels in an agreement with President George W. Bush. When violence exploded in Juarez, the now President Calderon sent thousands of troops to restore order in the city in a combined military and police campaign known as Chihuahua Joint Operation. Hijas de su Maquilera Madre is a feminist border collective fighting against human trafficking, femicides, disappearances, and for the defense of the territory around Juarez.
Felipe Calderon declares the war on drugs. His slogan was, "So the drugs don't get to the kids, right?" So this activates the Chihuahua Plan, which is to bring hundreds of military and federal agents, along with the municipal police, with the state police and many police forces. These forces of the municipal police are also militarized. They are given large weapons.
Calderon realized that drug trafficking was not governed by cartels, but by the police forces of the entities he sent the army to, because it was controlled here by some elements of the state investigative police and the municipal police.
That's journalist Julian Cardona.
He realized that he had to exert control over the drug trade, so much so that he decided to send the army and the federal police to take control from them, which is something we did see happen. He took control from them. The drug market was not taken down, on the contrary. When the soldiers were here, large and small-scale drug trafficking grew. The drug trade grew. However, the narrative in the media and in the official narrative is that there has been a war between cartels in Juarez. State violence from the government itself has never been deemed an element of consideration. This violence we've had in recent years is more like government violence to me, injected by the state itself, in which the ordinary citizen is the target of, is subject. Any citizen, the violence and the rights are not respected. We saw it very clearly with the military incursion that Calderon ordered here. Military and federal agents who committed mass violations of anyone's human rights, from alleged criminals to alleged perpetrators of whatever stuff they came up with. There were a lot of innocent people imprisoned.
The members of Hijas de su Maquilera Madre say that it was the city's youth who bore the burden of this violence.
Before, it was known that the conflicts among drug lords happened solely amongst them, between those who were involved in the drug cartels. But with Calderon's war, we see an administration, mainly the youth population, young people who begin to be criminalized for being young. Because it was precisely the youth of Juarez that was being murdered, right? In neighborhoods with poverty and vulnerability. I was a teenager at the time, and you realize that suddenly messages would circulate on social networks saying, "There's a curfew." At such time, you have to go into your houses, and whoever comes out of the street, we're going to shoot them.
When the army came into Juarez, the city was demanding action. There were encuestas, surveys after surveys saying, we need the army, we need help. The federal government has abandoned us. And yet, within a year, the populace was like, no, this is not working. You are violating human rights everywhere. We are angry. We're tired of the roadblocks that pop up and make it 3 hours before you can get to work. They lost the hearts and minds, if you will, of the people relatively quickly.
The women of Hijas de su Maquilera Madre were young girls during the outbreak of the war in the city.
To think about myself, during that period, well, I was very, very young. I had just started elementary school, and it really was a matter of fear. I grew up locked up in my house. I have very few memories of going out to play, and, well, the memories I have of going to the park, well, it was
dead bodies covered on blankets in front of my house or things like that. At some point, I saw a beheaded person outside my elementary school. That's also when the tabloids here, they started to boom. They had very graphic images that were shown to us in our daily lives.
The members of the student collective Uni Unida experienced a similar upheaval to their lives during the war.
It had a very strong impact on my childhood, this violence that we experience here in the city. I could hardly go outside to play, and I remember that near my house, they had a curfew. So at a certain time, we couldn't go out anymore. And the house across the street would be full of military. And I would always be like in panic. My grandmother and I locked ourselves in a room, and she would try to tell me stories or talk to me about other things to stop me from thinking about it all the time. But still, you're sensitive to what is going on around, and so it is difficult. It instilled in me a sort of feeling like panic, like terror, of self-preservation, and a very strong feeling of not wanting to see these raw images anymore that were shown everywhere. A strange feeling of being fed up. At 9 years old, I was feeling depressed and worn out.
As Juarez descended into violence, on the other side of the Rio Grande, El Paso, Texas, had been steadily climbing in the rankings of America's safest municipalities. In 2010, El Paso was officially named the safest city in the United States, a title it would continue to hold for 3 consecutive years. Even drug lords began migrating their families north of the border. They lived and studied in the U.S. and operated a war in Mexico. Prior to the Mexican-American War, Juarez and El Paso had been joined as a single city. The gulf of a few hundred yards that now separated the two might well have been 1,000,000 miles. Journalist Lorena Figueroa.
Sometimes even people here from El Paso think that Juarez is in Guatemala or it's just in another country, even though we have it next to us. And there's a different perspective also on how from outside you look into Juarez when you don't live there, when you don't live in Juarez. Now with El Paso, you have all the local agencies here, local, state, and federal agencies. You have law enforcement everywhere. Also, you have to know that El Paso is half the population than Juarez. You don't have that many problems with infrastructure, with getting resources, with getting education, with getting even a job. I think that when someone wants to commit a crime here, they think it twice. There's corruption, but not as corruption that we still have in Mexico. But that's one of the reasons why you have, ironically, on one side, the safest city in the United States, and the other side, the most dangerous city, not even in Mexico, in the world.
Villas de Salvarcar is a working-class neighborhood in southern Juarez. Most of the families worked in the maquiladora industry. There was a boy who was turning 18 years old, and he decided to have a party to celebrate his birthday in a vacant house on one of the streets in the neighborhood. Most of the kids who were at the party were high school students. They all played football, American football. The football league that these kids played on was the AA football league. Apparently, there was a kid in the neighborhood who was not part of the party, who knew that the party was coming. He apparently fed that information to the Aztecas, who thought it was a party for the artistas asesinos, who went by the acronym of the double A's, artista asesino, AA. The party gets going, everybody's having a great time, and around midnight, a convoy of, I think it was 3 SUVs full of Aztecas shows up, and they get out, and they just go into this house and just massacre all these kids. I think there were maybe 15 or 16 people killed, another 40 or so wounded. Some kids were able to jump over the back fence. Some were able to find places to hide in the house. The whole thing lasted just a few minutes, but it was a bloodbath. I talked to somebody who went into the house in the immediate aftermath, actually looking for his son, who described the amount of blood. It was just horrendous, because these kids were trapped. They just shot them point blank with automatic weapons. It was a terrible tragedy.
After years of enduring the violence that had engulfed Juarez, the murder of 15 innocent teenagers in the Salvarcar Youth Massacre was the straw that broke the camel's back.
It was a turning point in Juarez for a couple of reasons. When the president, Felipe Calderon, who is in Japan on a foreign mission, when he is asked about the massacre Villa de Salvarcar, immediately in the aftermath, nobody really knows for sure what's happened. He says, well, a lot of these kids were involved in gangs. They were high school students. They were student athletes. Some of them had won the governor's education award. They were just kids. And so there was a tremendous outrage. The families repudiated these public statements that were ill-informed by the president of Mexico.
Calderon made 3 visits to Juarez in the month after the Salvarcar massacre to contain the damage from his remarks, and met with the families of the victims. He changed his narrative of blaming the young boys, but never did he once mention how femicide victims in the city had been discriminated against and blamed for their own death. Even in crime, gender bias is an issue. During Calderon's trips to Juarez, he also met with local officials and civic groups to begin formulating a plan that would halt the violence and rebuild the city.
The Mexican government had been going to Medellin, Colombia, to Rio de Janeiro, looking at communities that were suffering high levels of violence, and in trying to study the models that were being used to intervene in those communities. They were about halfway through that process when Villa de Salvarcar happens. They fast-track a massive intervention in the city that involved the investment of about $250 million in a program called Todos Somos Juarez. They built several high schools. They built a lot of elementary schools. They funded after-school programs so kids could have a place to be at school and not have to go back to their neighborhoods where their parents were working at the maquilas, and there were gangs waiting for you to come home. I don't remember how many orchestras they funded across the city. They had programs for unemployment training. Juarez became the first city in Mexico to get full health coverage. There were a lot of things that came out of Todos Somos Juarez that affected the social fabric of the city. There were other variables too. But that infusion of money, I think, is, in my opinion, an under-acknowledged contributor to the reduction of violence.
Chihuahua Governor Cesar Duarte created a special anti-kidnapping unit called for tough sentences to deter crimes and took measures to increase the power of the state's Public Security Council. Former Tijuana Police Chief Julian Leizaola Perez was hired as police chief and Public Safety Secretary for Juarez. Leizaola had been credited with reducing drug violence, but he also faced numerous allegations of human rights violations, including torture and extrajudicial murders. Charges that follow him to Juarez. He even admitted on the record in an interview with San Juana Martinez for La Jornada newspaper that he used to kill criminals, including women who he suspected of being involved in crime. Whether it was Leizaola's questionable tactics as police chief, the new government security measures, anti-corruption efforts, or various economic initiatives, by 2012 and 2013, no one could deny that crime in Juarez was starting to go down. The Sinaloa Cartel was ruling Chihuahua and harvesting opium poppy up in the mountains. After peaking at about 3,700 homicides in 2010, the number of murders in the city was down by 80% just 2 years later and had fallen to 250 homicides by 2015. But Julian Cardona says that many Juarez residents have a simpler answer for why the violence started to go down.
When this drop occurred, I was still reporting for Reuters. We did a story and asked a number of people about why was violence reduced. Most of them, if not all, said to us, it was reduced because the soldiers and the federal agents left. That would be the answer. I'm going to quote a friend of mine. He works at the Juarez consulate. He's Mexican. He said, if there's one thing we realized in this time with Calderon, is that the more police officers, the greater the amount of crime. There was a generation of young people that grew up locked in. And that's a generation that we're now seeing suffering because it is a great social wound, a great social trauma that was left to us by militarization.
The young members of Hijas de su Maquilera Madre say that their generation is still marked by its experience during the war.
I have friends who disappeared back then, who were killed back then, relatives also. So I survived that. So that's why I called myself a war child. And the generations that were there and that survived that very tough chapter, well, we survived. And we are what's left of that generation, war children, boys and girls.
The members of Uni Unida.
There's a lot of complaining from grown-ups to the current generations, right? Like, you kids just don't go out to play anymore. Just look at him. He's always watching TV or things like that, right? But it's also because at a certain point, violence started to get ugly. And even our parents are like, yeah, you can go and hang out with your friends, but only indoors, right? Or here in the patio or that kind of thing. Our childhood was not as unrestricted as it was in other generations.
I was kind of lucky in a way, right? Because a lot of people lost someone close to them. But it did happen to me, for instance, that my aunt was forced out of her car at gunpoint to try to kidnap her. My grandfather had an attempted kidnapping too. A very close friend of my mom's was also killed. A friend of the family and part of our inner circle as well. So, I mean, maybe I didn't lose someone directly from my family core, but there were many losses around me. I was in my teens and somehow, well, this issue of these feelings I had when I was 9 years old, when I wanted to preserve my life, and at the same time I felt extremely depressed about our situation. I kept feeling like that, right? And I kept even having an inner struggle because, well, I was afraid to be a woman in the city. Because it's women and the general population they are killing for profit during these imaginary wars.
Why do you call them imaginary wars?
Because it's not a war against drugs. It is a war against its very population. The drug trade continues because the spheres of power and people who are part of the government continue to profit from drug trafficking and continue to profit from the bodies of women and young boys and girls. And it affects all of us. And it affects these working classes even more. So, that's why it's an imaginary war.
The Red Note is a production of Imperative Entertainment. It was hosted by Lydia Cacho and written and directed by Craig Whitney. Executive producers are Jason Hoke and Lydia Cacho. Lead producer is me, Estefania Bonilla Hernandez, and producers are Laura Caulfield, Will Wallace, and Craig Whitney. Research and interviews conducted by Alicia Fernandez. Sound recording by Nicolás Aguilar Jiménez and designed by Javier Umpierrez. LA recording engineer is Tom Corcoran. Dubbing directed by Rebecca Gomez and performed by Isabel Ireland, Rona Fletcher, Arturo Mercado Jr., and Genaro Vázquez. Music composed by Michael Ramos. Abraham Buendia recording the making of and stills. Our production fixer was René Nava. Production bands were provided by our drivers Arturo and Ricardo Baeza in Ciudad Juarez and in Mexico City by Hugo Ramos. The production accounting supervised by Viridiana Morales and performed by Miguel Torres at Global Entertainment Firm. Insurance provided by Jasmine Alba and Ricardo Carrillo at LCI Seguros. Lorena Olivares is assistant to the director. Legal services provided by Laura Caulfield in the U.S. and in Mexico by Laura Marvan at Marvan Pitol Abogados. The production was coordinated by Minerva Bolaños and supervised by Héctor Subieta. The producers wish to thank Adam Abruzzo, Dr. Edgardo Buscaglia, Daniel Espinosa Ochoa, Mike Hisi, Adriana Montalvo, Tony Montanieri, and Maria Rosa Ochoa for their gracious help with this podcast. We would especially like to thank Luis Chaparro and Ikae Chituda at the Chihuahua Film Commission and the people of Ciudad Juarez for their hospitality and support during the production. If you enjoyed the Red Note, please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you listen to. Thanks again for listening.
We're joined now by journalist Alicia Fernandez in Ciudad Juarez, who conducted the interviews for this podcast. Alicia, you were working as a reporter and a fixer in Juarez during the war. Can you tell us what it was like?
Of course, Lydia. I work as a photographer for El Diario de Juarez on the night shift, and it was very painful that sometimes we went to several places where a murder had been committed. It was somewhat unpredictable, which made it very risky, but it was the only way to have their own version of the events outside the official versions of the government. Once I was in the middle of a shooting with hundreds of elements firing, and I saw both sides. Another time I received a call saying that there was a death in some public place, and I went with a colleague to see what happened. And in the designated place, they killed a person in front of us. Such situations were many for those of us who covered the conflict.
Can you tell us about how journalists from outside Mexico reported on the violence that was taking place in the city around this time?
All kind of international media have gone to Juarez. Great reporters from all over the world, which was good because everybody was looking at what was happening there. Actually, I work as a producer for many of them. The border has always been a reference for other places.
Did you ever work with any reporters whose approach to covering the violence in Juarez was more sensationalistic?
Well, some people in the media who travel to Juarez are just interested in the sensationalism and violence. But it's difficult to put together all the media in the same box, because there are also like freelance journalists who spend all their money going to Juarez, who try to do a good job reporting on a very difficult situation. Well, in the digital era, all the media companies have limited resources, so sometimes they have to define what is the priority for them. It is a complex issue.
Thank you, Alicia.
Fred Gomez Carrasco was a notorious drug cartel boss from San Antonio. After years earning millions and running from the cops, Carrasco was serving a life sentence when he decided to break out of the Walls Unit, the oldest prison in Texas. Carrasco and two henchmen took over the prison library. They held teachers and librarians captive as Carrasco bartered for his freedom.
Now there's only one way that these people will see the light again, and that's for you to cooperate.
The standoff set off one of the worst hostage crises in American history, the 1974 Huntsville prison siege.
This will be our last day to live if somebody doesn't come through and help us. They're desperate men and they mean business.
He's fixing to shoot me. I'm fixing to die if you don't do something right now. And the rest of us in there are going to die too. These people don't have anything to lose and they're serious.
And it's all on tape.
Fred, the governor's on for you. The governor wants to talk to you.
He can shove it.
From Imperative Entertainment, this is Standoff.
Dead or alive, I'm going out.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.